I'm Simon Kilmurray, executive producer of POV. Today I'm talking with filmmaker Marshall Curry, whose film If a Tree Falls, a story of the Earth Liberation Front, will be broadcast on POV in September 2011.
I moved out west in October of '98. I got out to Northern California.
I had never seen trees like that before. It had a really profound impact on me. I was already quite radicalized, but I couldn't believe the fact that people accepted what was going on.
I have memories of like for the first time seeing log trucks, you know, and being like, whoa. You saw the mills, or you go into the forest and you stumble upon a clear cut. Like, it just blew me away. Just the arrogance of it. I was like, man, this is butchered. You know, it made me think, like, why are we being so gentle? Why are we so gentle in our activism when this is what's happening, you know?
Tell us what the film is about in your own words.
The film tells the story of Daniel McGowan, who was a radical environmentalist who burned a couple of timber facilities in Oregon when he was part of the Earth Liberation Front. And I sort of stumbled on the story, or it sort of dropped in my lap. My wife runs a domestic violence organization in Brooklyn and came home from work one day and told me that 4 federal agents had walked into her office that day and arrested one of her employees. And it was this guy, Daniel. And you know, I knew him a little bit, and his background was the opposite of what you might think of. He'd grown up in Rockaway, Queens. His dad was a cop in New York, and you know, he was a business major in college. And so I thought, how could this guy be somebody who winds up facing life in prison for terrorism? And that was kind of what kicked off the story. And so the Sam Coleman, who shot and co-directed the film with me, and I decided to find out.
So how did you persuade Daniel to participate in the film?
You know, he was in trouble because he had opened his mouth on tape, and you know, he ended up getting recorded by an informant, and so he was kind of reluctant to let somebody into his house, into his life with a camera, but I think he felt like he had a story that was really important that people needed to know about, and people needed to think a little bit about activism and terrorism and the way we use the word terrorism, and so ultimately, you know, he kind of took a leap of faith.
In Daniel, you have a main character who's in some legal jeopardy, and I'm curious as to him participating in this, whether that raises any kind of ethical issues, or does his participation in the film affect the outcome?
For much of the time when we were filming, he was saying that he was innocent, and which he needed to do. Until you've pled guilty, you'd be a fool to tell an independent filmmaker, by the way, I actually did do it. For a while when we were shooting, he needed to be careful about what he said. After he took a plea bargain, that was when you know, there were no holds barred after that. And it's funny, when we were editing the film, we originally thought that that would be a very significant part of the arc of the story. This question of, did he do it, did he not do it? And after a while, we began to realize that that wasn't the interesting story. Did he do it or did he not do it? What's interesting is the why and the how did this happen. Not, you know, what were the events that led him to do it, not whether he did it or not. And so we decided to just edit in a completely different way. The very first thing he says is, in 2001, I participated in these fires as part of the Earth Liberation Front. People consider me a terrorist, but it's more complicated than you think. And that's kind of the thesis statement for the movie, that it's more complicated than you think.
So how did you persuade, particularly the other, you know, Tim and Suzanne, to also be sharing their experience as kind of this chorus of voices?
I would say access was definitely the most difficult. That was the biggest challenge. Ultimately, I just had to spend time explaining to people what my actual goal was for the film. And you know, you just look people in the eye and you say, this movie is not going to be just your point of view. I'm going to be talking to people who disagree with you, but I promise you that I will never edit you out of context. I'm not going to, you know, cut right before you say but, blah, 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 blah. And to me, the most interesting films are films that take very strong points of view and bang them up against each other and let sparks happen.
It was somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m. when I was home sound asleep and I got a phone call. And of course, anytime you get a phone call at 2 a.m. in the morning, it's not good news. It turned the office into just a fiery oven. I mean, I don't know how hot it got in here, but we had keyboards that were, I mean, you couldn't tell one key from the other. They were just melted together.
I went up to Portland and wrote the communique and sent it in. Even then, it wasn't real. It was just like still like kind of this cartoonish thing. And it wasn't real until I really saw the newspapers, seeing the man from the company, I think Steve Swanson, just walking through this like charred remains, and I was just like, holy crap.
That was a major blow to our mental psyche, at least in the short run. Just felt like you know, a big hole in my heart.
In Eugene, people were jazzed. When the big bad bully gets, you know, hit in the stomach and feels a little something and maybe a little fear or whatever, that felt good.
It was exciting. The next day I felt, you know, like, wow, I've actually done something where it stopped.
I didn't have a problem with what I was doing. I thought it was effective. It was $1 million or something like that. You know, it's like when you're involved with it and you're in the thick of it, it's hard to look at like all the consequences and like the real repercussions of that. Like, you know, did this action push them in a better direction? Did it scare them? Did it help the movement in any capacity on old growth logging? There's lots of questions, but I don't think at the time I was asking those questions too much.
The goal of the film, ultimately, I think, is to try to nudge everybody out of their comfort zone a little bit. And I don't think that we're going to turn an Earth Liberation Front supporter into a prosecutor. And I don't think we're going to turn the prosecutor into an Earth Liberation Front supporter. And that wouldn't be the goal. But I think that after watching the film, all of those different people have been stretched a little bit. And I know my point of view, as I was making the film, got stretched every time that we met somebody new and talked to somebody new.
So your point of view was stretched and challenged. Elaborate on that for me.
You know, I think that every time that we talked to people, they shifted us a little bit. And you know, it's easy to say, well, these fires are just property destruction. That was something that a lot of people said. They're just property destruction. They're just property destruction. And then you go and you meet with the owner of the timber facility, and he says, first, let me show you these photos. And you see the photos, the fires, and they're huge, and they're scary. And he says, well, after these fires, I didn't know who had done them. And I had to look under my truck. You know, every time I got in my truck and turned the ignition key, I wondered if it was going to burst into flames. Or I wondered if they were going to come and burn my house down. And then you go out in the woods and you see stumps of trees that are 700 years old, 1,000 years old. And it's not to say that Steve Swanson was cutting those trees down, but there were irreplaceable resources that were being destroyed during those years. You know, you can replant a tree, but you can't replant a 700-year-old tree. It takes 700 years to grow a 700-year-old tree. And in the end of the film, the prosecutor on the case has a really amazing line, and I had done probably a 2.5-hour interview with him, and at the end, just before he took his mic off, I said, have you had any new, has this case changed you at all? Has there been anything that surprised you as you were working on the case? And he says this great line where he says, you know, when I started off, I saw these people as mugshots and as I just saw their criminal behavior. But as I've worked on this investigation, I still think that their behavior is criminal. I still think that they should go to prison, but I've started to understand by looking at their background and looking at their lives and looking at the things that they cared about, I've started to understand what took them to the point that they wound up on.
Going off that, there's a repeated theme that comes up in the film, and that's that line between criminality and terrorism. And it's something you address repeatedly in the film. How did you go about addressing it, and did your perspective on it change at all?
Ultimately, I think Sam, the co-director, and I feel most comfortable with one of the last lines of the terrorism debate, which is the detective, a police captain who worked on the case for years, and he says, I don't know, is it terrorism? He said, it's true. One person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. And I think that the word terrorism is probably one that, you know, creates more heat than light. And it might be a word that we do better to not even include in our vocabulary, just because it's so radioactive and yet so imprecise. You know, Lisa, Daniel's sister, you know, she grew up in Rockaway, Queens, and in Rockaway there are a lot of cops and firefighters who live there. And in fact, that is the area of New York that lost more dads than any husbands, dads, than any other in New York City. And she says, you know, I was here on 9/11. I don't need you to tell me that these people are terrorists. I know what terrorism is. And to call my brother, who won't even eat meat because he doesn't want to harm animals, a terrorist, to use the same word to describe Al-Qaeda and my brother is, you know, just doesn't make any sense. I studied religion when I was in college and was a religion major and really wanted to figure out if there was God and how we should live our lives. And when I graduated, one of my friends said to me, you know, I'm still confused, but just at a higher level. And in some ways I feel like after having made this film, we're still confused, but hopefully just at a higher level. We're not trying to answer people's questions about activism and terrorism and all of these things. We're mostly just trying to elevate the conversation a little bit and have people discuss it and think about it in maybe a little more nuanced and a little more complex way.
The word terrorism to me is about killing humans. It's about ending innocent life. And that is the antithesis of what these people did. Concern for life was a very big part of the plan and implementation of these actions, and is why no one was ever harmed or injured in them. 1,200 incidents are being accredited to the ELF and ALF in this country, and not a single injury or death. Those statistics don't happen by accident.
Terrorist acts, under the definition in the law, can vary all over the board. There's no requirement for purposes of terrorism that you physically endanger another person's life. I mean, you don't have to be Bonnie and Clyde to be a bank robber, and you don't have to be Al-Qaeda to be a terrorist.
I don't think these people are terrorists. I think the people and the agencies and the industry that they're fighting are the true terrorists. When you've got big timber companies coming into the Northwest, clear-cutting old-growth forests, big oil companies with their big oil spills that cost billions and billions and billions of dollars. You don't see the FBI raiding these executives' homes or anything like that. They aren't being threatened with life in prison. All they really do is just pay a fine and move on to the next quarter.
How do you see yourself as a journalist, as an artist, as a storyteller? And what is it in particular about the documentary form that can take these complicated stories and give them a space to be laid out without providing neat solutions, but kind of celebrating the nuance?
To me, the balance between being a journalist, being an artist, being a storyteller, documentary filmmakers are all three of those things, and the balance between them probably depends is affected by the film itself, the topic of the film. You know, a lot of times when we were editing, Matt Hamachek and I would say, okay, if this were a fiction film, what would happen now? And that was a way of sort of pulling us out of, you know, taking off our journalistic hats and putting on our storytelling hats. Because there are times where if you were writing an article for the newspaper, it would be thesis statement, you know, information, supporting arguments, and that would be how it would be set up. But when you're making a documentary, the pacing of the film and the way that you sort of switch from character to character, or the way that sometimes you hold information until later. So you introduce somebody and you want to create a question before you answer it. Maybe you want to leave a question for a while before you answer it. All of those are kind of more about storytelling than straight journalism.
You talked about some of that footage of the police response and the trees being cut down before the city council meeting, and I'm curious how you went about finding some of that, because it is quite shocking.
There's sort of two main chunks of archival footage. A lot of it came from one guy, Tim Lewis, who is a character in the film. In some ways, he kind of is our narrator in the film, and he was a guy who we just stumbled on. We were looking for someone in Oregon to film people walking up the courthouse steps. And since we're based in New York, we didn't want to fly out for just this one hearing where we would see people walk up and down the courthouse steps. So we put an ad on Craigslist, and he answered it. And the next time that we went out to Eugene, we got together with him, and he said, you know, I've also got some footage you might want to take a look at. And it turned out that he had for years been collecting most of it he shot, but much of it he just held for other activists. He was kind of a repository for activists to give footage to. And he had this unbelievable archive of so many of the important moments that were part of our story.
They're tear gassing the crowd and pepper spraying the crowd. It was just crazy, frantic scene that day.
And they used about 12 to 15 cans on Flynn, and he stayed up for, I think, about 6 or 7 hours, man.
And then they, flushed me with a bunch of water, took me to the hospital, and then took me to jail. And so for the next 35 hours, I was soaking in pepper spray. My hands were orange for a week.
And so the argument that you need to work within the system was pretty well dashed by what the cops did on that day in Eugene. And June 1st was really the day that pissed off a lot of people in this town.
In If a Tree Falls, there is a section where you look at Daniel's increasing radicalization. And I thought it was this very interesting moment where he's talking about going to Wetlands, a venue in New York City where he's watching documentary films and how they play a part in his radicalization. And I was wondering, as a filmmaker, what your thoughts on that were, and the role of documentaries in both engaging audiences, but also in motivating them to be participants, and where those lines get drawn.
The goal of this film is to get people to think about environmentalism and activism and maybe for the first time, but it doesn't. I think it's less of a call to action than it is a cautionary tale. I think it's a cautionary tale for activists to say, think carefully about the way that you try to achieve change, and think about the tactics, the sort of ethical and legal and effectiveness of your tactics. But it's also a cautionary tale, I think, for the rest of society to say, we need to think carefully about the way that we respond to activism. because there are certain types of responses to activism that radicalize people, and there are certain kinds of responses to activism that bring people into the democratic process. And you know, meeting nonviolent activism with physical abuse or pepper spray or things like that, I think are counterproductive. And in fact, they radicalize people instead of inviting those people to take part in democracy.